There are things that get said between people who have been through everything together that cannot be said any other way. Not in conversation. Conversation requires the presence of the other person, and when that presence is gone, the conversation ends. Not in interviews. Interviews require the mediation of a third party, a question, a context, a performance of accessibility that shapes what is said into what can be received by an audience. Not in letters. Letters require the belief that the person you are writing to will eventually read them, and when that belief is no longer available, the letter form collapses into something else. What is left, for people who have spent their lives speaking in music, is music. The only language that does not require the other person to be present, that can be addressed to someone who is gone, that carries what needs to be said into the silence the gone person has left and holds it there without needing a response. On the night of December 8th, 1980, George Harrison was in a recording studio in London when he received the news that John Lennon had been shot outside the Dakota Building in New York. He was 37 years old. He had known John Lennon for 23 years, had been brought into the Beatles as a 15-year-old guitar prodigy by Paul McCartney, had spent the most formative decade of his life inside the band that John had built and led and eventually dissolved, had absorbed more of John's influence on his own musical and spiritual development than he had always been credited for, and had spent the years since the Beatles ended in the particular complex relationship that people have with those who have shaped them most fundamentally, loving them, occasionally resenting them, being unable to fully escape the measure of who he had become against who they were. The studio was quiet when the news came. The engineer who was present, whose name has been given in some accounts as Ken Scott, though the precise record is uncertain, and what matters is not the specific name but the specific witnessing, received it first. He told George, "What happened next is the part of the story that has never been fully told." George Harrison picked up a guitar. He sat in a chair in the recording booth and he played, not a song with a beginning and an end and a structure and a purpose, something that moved the way grief moves, not in a straight line, not toward a destination, but circling, returning, finding a phrase and staying with it, and then losing it and finding something else and circling back. He played for a long time. At some point he stopped and said nothing for a while, and then he wept quietly in the way that people weep when they are not performing the weeping but simply cannot prevent it. And then he played again. The recording machines in the studio were running. The engineer had not stopped them when the news came in, had not made the decision to turn them off, had simply left them running in the particular uncertain paralysis of someone who does not know what is happening or what the appropriate response to it is. And so what George Harrison played that night, the circling, the grief, the return to the guitar after the tears, was captured on tape. The tape has never been released. As far as anyone who has spoken publicly about that night is aware, it has never been heard outside the room where it was made. George Harrison chose not to release it. He never explained the choice in any interview or public statement. The tape, if it still exists, is wherever it is. The music on it is wherever music goes when it has been made and not shared, not lost exactly, but absent from the world in the particular way of something that exists but cannot be reached. What follows is the story of why the recording matters even though it cannot be heard, of what George Harrison and John Lennon were to each other, and what that night contained, and what the unreleased tape represents in the story of two people who spent most of their lives speaking in music, and who, on the night of December 8th, 1980, were left with only one of them still able to play. George Harrison was 15 years old when Paul McCartney introduced him to John Lennon in early 1958. The introduction required some negotiation. John's initial response to the idea of adding another member to the Quarrymen was ambivalent. The band's internal dynamics were already established, and the instinct to protect those dynamics against disruption was real. What changed his mind was hearing George play. The technical fluency was immediately apparent. George had been learning guitar with the dedicated, systematic intensity of someone for whom the instrument had become a total absorbing passion, practicing until his fingers bled and then practicing more, developing a facility that exceeded John's own at the same age by a considerable margin. John listened to the 15-year-old play and heard, in the precision and the feeling simultaneously present in the playing, someone whose musical instincts were trustworthy. He invited George in. what John may not have fully understood at that moment, what he could not have understood. Because the understanding came from the years of working together, from the accumulation of a decade of shared creative experience, was how much George was absorbing from him. Not the guitar playing, which was Paul's influence more than John's, something deeper and less visible, a way of thinking about music as more than entertainment, as a form of truth-telling, as a medium in which the things that cannot be said any other way can be said. John had arrived at this understanding through Julia's death, and the grief he had converted into energy, and the energy he had converted into music. George would arrive at it through a different route, through the Indian philosophy and the Vedantic traditions and the specific spiritual searching that defined his post-Beatles life, but the direction was the same, and John had pointed toward it first. The Beatles' years were, for George, simultaneously the most formative and the most constrictive experience of his creative life. The most formative because of what being inside that particular creative environment taught him, the standards, the ambition, the refusal of the adequate thing in favor of the true thing, the sense of what music could be and do when it was made by people who cared about making it as well as it could be made. The most constrictive because the songwriting partnership between John and Paul left almost no space for a third voice. George's contributions to Beatles recordings were limited in number, and in the autonomy he was permitted in making them, the junior member, the youngest, the one whose songs were given less studio time and less prominent placement, whose creative development happened partially in the shadow of two people who did not always see clearly past their own creative relationship. He understood this. He bore it with varying degrees of patience across the Beatles' years, and he spoke about it with varying degrees of directness in the years after. What he never denied was what the experience had given him alongside what it had withheld. John Lennon had given him something that could not be taken back, a sense of what music was for, what it could reach, what it meant to make it as honestly as possible regardless of whether the world was ready for the honesty. After the Beatles dissolved, George proved what the constrictive years had been building. All Things Must Pass, the triple album he released in 1970, was received as one of the great post-Beatles statements, not a declaration of freedom from the band, so much as evidence of how much had accumulated behind the gates the band's internal dynamic had kept. Closed, song after song of a quality that surprised even people who had followed his work closely, produced by a person who had been waiting, without quite knowing he was waiting, for the space in which to make them. John heard it. He said in the direct way he said things that he was surprised by how good it was. The surprise itself was its own kind of tribute, the honest reaction of someone who had not fully understood what had been developing beside him. The relationship between John and George in the years after the Beatles was not simple, and it was not continuous. They were in each other's lives in the way that people are in each other's lives when they have shared something fundamental and then moved on to separate existences, present in each other's thinking, occasionally in each other's company, separated by geography and by the different directions their post-Beatles careers had taken. John in New York, consumed by the activism and then the 5 years of domestic quiet. George in England and then on his own terms, making records and producing records and pursuing the spiritual practices that had become the organizing principle of his life. There were phone calls, there were occasional visits. There was the specific, unmanageable quality of a connection that had been forged in extraordinary circumstances, and that neither time nor distance could fully dissolve because the circumstances had been too fundamental, had gone too deep to be reduced to a casual acquaintance. George had played slide guitar on the recording of How Do You Sleep, John's confrontational response to Paul's public statements about the Beatles' dissolution. This was an act of loyalty and of its own kind of complexity. Loyalty to John, whose cause he had chosen to support in the most public way available, and complexity in the awareness that the song was aimed at a third person who had also been his bandmate and his friend. He had showed up when John needed someone to show up. He had brought his guitar and he had played. John had attended the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, George's landmark humanitarian project, the first major benefit concert in rock history, organized in a matter of weeks in response to the famine and refugee crisis following the Bangladesh Liberation War. John had been invited, had agreed to perform, and had then withdrawn at the last moment, for reasons that George never fully understood and that the historical record has not fully clarified. The withdrawal had cost something, not the friendship exactly, but something in the friendship, some small deposit of trust that the subsequent years did not fully restore. These were the textures of their relationship in the years before December 1980, not estranged, not easy, real in the way that long relationships are real, marked by what has passed between them, by the full complexity of everything two people accumulate when they have known each other since one of them was 15 and the other was 17. The news arrived in the London studio at some point in the late hours of December 8th, early December 9th by British time, accounting for the 5-hour difference between London and New York. The engineer received it first. George was in another part of the studio, or in the control room, or in the position of someone who was working and then suddenly was not, because the work had stopped being possible. What is known from the accounts that exist? Fragmentary, told at second or third hand, arriving through the kind of oblique reference that people make when they are describing something they are not sure they should be describing, is the sequence. The news, the guitar picked up, the playing that was not a song, the silence and then the weeping and then the playing again. The engineer left the machines running. This may have been presence of mind, the instinct of someone who understood that what was happening was something that should be preserved. Or it may have been the simple paralysis of someone who did not know what to do and therefore did nothing, which sometimes produces the same result. Either way, the machines ran. George played for an extended period. How long is not confirmed. Long enough that the tape, if it was captured in real time without interruption, would be of significant length, not a brief improvisation, but something more sustained, something that moved through phases the way extended grief moves through phases, the acute and the numb and the acute again, the moment of feeling and the moment of not feeling and the return of the feeling. He did not write a song that night, or if he did, the song did not appear on any subsequent recording. What was on the tape was not a composition in the conventional sense, not something with a structure designed to be heard and received by an audience. It was something more interior than that, more private, the specific kind of musical expression that has no audience in mind because the person it is addressed to is not here to receive it, and the person making it is not in a state that allows for the calculation of reception. The real question, the one that the unreleased tape makes impossible to answer with certainty, is what George Harrison was saying that night to John Lennon in the only language they had always shared. What we know about what George Harrison felt about John Lennon comes from the things he said publicly, over the years, in the interviews and the writings and the occasional direct statements that he made about the relationship and about what the loss meant. He spoke about John with a combination of love and honesty that was characteristic of him, the willingness to hold the complexity without simplifying it into either pure tribute or unresolved grievance. He acknowledged what John had given him. He acknowledged what the Beatles' years had cost him. He said in one interview that John was the person who had first shown him that music could be used for something more than entertainment, that it could be a form of seeking, a way of looking for the truth rather than simply a way of producing pleasure or selling records. He said that the loss was not something he expected to get over, and that he was not sure he wanted to get over it, because getting over it would mean losing the specific quality of presence that grief gives to the person it is about, the way that loss makes someone more vivid in the mind, more present in the interior life, more alive in the thinking than they often were when they were physically present, and therefore taken for granted. He wrote in the years after 1980, songs that carried John's influence without directly referencing it, songs in the meditative, truth-seeking mode that John had first shown him was available to rock music, songs that ask the same questions about consciousness and impermanence and what endures beyond the physical that George's spiritual practice had been asking, and that John's music had always, in its own way, been asking alongside. He never released the tape. He never, as far as the public record shows, explained why. Perhaps the explanation is simple. Perhaps what was on the tape was too private, too raw, too specifically addressed to a person who could not receive it, to survive being translated into a product for consumption. The tape was not a record in the musical sense, it was a conversation. A one-sided conversation, which is what grief always is, and the specific quality of a one-sided conversation is that it belongs only to the person having it. Releasing it would have been giving the world access to something that was never meant for the world. Or perhaps the explanation is something else entirely. Perhaps George listened back to it once and heard in it something so complete and so specific to the night it was made that releasing it would have been a diminishment, would have reduced to a listening experience something that had been, in the making of it, an act of the most fundamental kind, a person speaking to someone they loved in the only way still available. The tape may still exist. It may not. George Harrison died in November 2001, 21 years after that December night, of lung cancer. He faced his own death with the equanimity that his decades of spiritual practice had prepared him for, and he said, near the end, that he was not afraid, that the journey was continuing rather than ending, that the things he had been seeking all his life were present and available to him. He had spent 21 years with the memory of that night in the studio, with the knowledge of what was on the tape, what it contained, what it said in the language that both of them had always spoken most fluently. The world has never heard it. He had heard it. He had kept it. That, too, is a form of love, the keeping of something that belongs to the two of you alone, not secret in the sense of hidden, but private in the sense of not requiring a wider audience to be real. The sound of one musician speaking to another in the only language they shared. On the night, the conversation became permanently one-sided. In the months and years after December 1980, George Harrison made music that people heard and music that stayed in the privacy of the studio, and the line between the two was determined by what felt ready to be given to the world and what felt like it still belonged somewhere else. All Those Years Ago, released in 1981, was the most direct public statement he made about John, a warm, poppy track, deliberately accessible, featuring Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr in what amounted to a partial Beatles reunion assembled in tribute to their absent fourth. It said what it said with the optimism that the form required. It was a tribute song, designed to be heard by the people who needed to hear it, that carried real emotion in the accessible package that public tributes require. It was not the tape. It was not what had been played in the London studio on the night of December 8th. It was the version of the feeling that could be given to the world, the version that the world could hold. The tape was the other version, the one that could not be held by anyone except the person who made it and the person it was made for, neither of whom in the end is here to explain it. What remains is the music that was released. Songs that George Harrison made across his solo career, carrying the influence of the person who first showed him what music could seek, speaking in the language they had both learned in the same rooms at the same age and never fully stopped speaking, even when the rooms were gone and the age was decades past and the other person was no longer able to answer. That music is still here. It plays. And somewhere inside it, in the specific quality of the seeking, in the meditative patience of the guitar, in the willingness to ask the questions that do not have comfortable answers, the night of December 8th, 1980 is present, not as a document, not as something that can be heard and held and replayed, as a silence, the specific silence of something that was said and kept and never given away. What do you say to someone who is gone in the only language you ever shared? George Harrison said it on a night in December 1980 into a microphone in a London studio with the recording machines running. The world has never heard it. It was never meant for the world.